Hello students, in this module we are going to talk about the challenge of ethnic identities in multi-ethnic multilingual societies like India. Now, the learning objectives of this particular module is to examine the nuances of the concept of ethnicity, to assess the role of ethnic markers in creating ethnic differentiation, ethnic identities, etc., to understand the nature of interactions between the ethnic groups and the state, and also to examine the various sociopolitical significances of ethnicity and ethnic movements in multi-ethnic societies like ours. Now, if one were to look at history, right from the time of 1870s up to 1960s, the world politics witnessed a decline in the political significance of various religious and ethnic cleavages that were characterizing national societies. Now, this was because it became easier for the state to address the issues of the economy, because they were much more measurable and quantifiable, rather than for the government to tackle ethnic, cultural and religious conflicts. From the 1970s onwards, however, one witnessed a rise of political conflicts all over the world, which had its root in ethnic cleavages. Now, like all other forms of identity markers, ethnic identities also is socially constructed. Ethnicity as a concept is socially constructed, and this was aided due to the emergence of the minority nationalist movements in different parts of the world, which made ethnic identities appear more definite and salient and important than the national identity. So, therefore, the decade of the 1970s saw claims by ethnic minorities in several states for cultural autonomy and for political independence. Across the world, countries like France, Spain, Canada became embroiled in ethnic struggles for secession. In the 1990s, the Balkans saw very violent conflicts between Serbs, Croats and the Albanians, and in Africa, in East Africa, Tutsis and the Hutus clashed to create a genocide in Rwanda and massacres in Burundi. Now, what is the impact of the ethnic conflicts on the state? This impact was quite significant, because one school of thought suggests that nation states would be replaced by ethnic groups, while another school of thought thinks that it is unlikely that we are witnessing the end of the nation states. The nation state will assert itself over ethnic groups. Now, as far as India is concerned, the central government responded to prolonged ethnic conflicts by creating regional councils, by creating minority representation in mainstream existing councils. They attempted national mediation to resolve ethnic conflicts. But these are the reasons due to which ethnic issues in India need deliberation. Now, let us start with the concept of ethnicity and what it means. When we look at the definition of ethnicity, it refers to a form of shared identity, perceived or actual, based on racial, linguistic or national identities of a social group. Several identities come together here, including cultural, religious, national, subcultural identities within this dimension of ethnicity. And when we talk about ethnicity, it is important to understand the difference between political and cultural ethnicity. While political ethnicity refers to political awareness and mobilization of a particular group, which has these characteristics, cultural ethnicity refers to a feeling of ethnic closeness or a feeling of identity based on shared religion, language, history, cultural values, practices, etc. A distinction can be drawn between those groups who actively seek to assert their ethnicity and those others who are designated as ethnic minorities by powerful groups in societies. There are also instances where ethnic characteristics may be exaggerated. They are purposively used to mobilize and accentuate the differences and division between groups. There are other also instances where cultural divisions are minimized. Now, when ethnicity is identified on the basis of the minority status, discriminatory practices against such groups may be legitimized by institutional means. For example, ethnic minorities may have difficulty in accessing education, in accessing health, employment, housing, etc. In other words, the group's life chances may be shaped by their ethnic locations. Let us talk about ethnic markers. What are ethnic markers? Ethnic markers are aspects which ensure that the social boundaries between ethnic groups are maintained by emphasizing differences around territoriality, around history, around language, symbols, etc. These act as ethnic markers. There are prescriptions and proscriptions around worship, around intermarriage of groups, and this is evoked, the idea of ethnic identity is evoked by taking into consideration ethnic markers. Different ethnic groups use ethnic markers to ensure that they are regarded as separate from the mainstream discourse. Now, what is the difference between race and ethnicity? While ethnicity is often conflated with race, the two concepts are not the same. For example, Tony Milton talks about how race pertains to biological differences based on skin color and features, whereas ethnicity refers to a particular community members who share common cultural traditions. It's basically the sharing of traditions, experiences and ways of life which makes ethnicity cultural rather than physical. Now, there are certain important issues which we should take into consideration when we take into consideration the overlap between ethnicity and race, and that is a particular person or a group may be a victim of racism because of the group's sense of his or her ethnicity. Similarly, questions of power and inequality may contribute to cultural differences between ethnic groups which have a racial dimension. In other words, those which are racially disadvantaged also have an ethnic disadvantage. Now, what is the politics around these ethnic groups? It is important to begin with the statement that the creation of ethnic group is the result of a political process. Many a times a group may feel that it is separate from the mainstream and may make claims to this separateness, whereas at other times the state may actively designate particular groups as ethnic groups. So, therefore, the formation of a group's identity and its differentiation is implicated in the political process. It is connected with the struggle for political power, recognition, etc. And therefore, in the West, many times the right-wing parties often make an appeal on the basis of their ethnic solidarity, whereas the sudden rise of the popularity of the ethnic groups puts the minority groups on the defensive. In other words, minorities have sought to organize themselves into political groups and parties which use religion, language and other such objective categories to ensure a sense of security and combat the majoritarianism of the ethnic groups. For example, the tribal Cobra Force of Bodoland, or say for example the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam in Sri Lanka, or say for example Mohajir Qawmi movement of Pakistan. These are three examples of political organizations that were set up by anxious ethnic minorities. In the global world, the national governments can no longer afford to ignore the demands of these organizations, as the governments are accountable to various international bodies. For example, every attack on the Palestinians by the Israelis evokes strong condemnation from almost all minority organizations across the world. Because of globalization and the development of communication on a global scale, ethnic minorities have come together like never before, and hence minority rights can never be sort of bypassed by the national governments, even if these minority groups are weaker. Say for example, there are networks between ethnic groups through which they receive aid, they receive assistance. For example, in the case of northeast of Sri Lanka, where Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam is used to receive a kind of assistance from other such groups. So therefore, governments are increasingly showing signs of resorting to violence and coercion in order to manage the resurgence of ethnic groups. An ethnic minority also feels that if they don't undertake the path of violence, they will not be recognized, they will not be, their issues will not be taken up, and therefore institutional politics have become more and more tolerant to violence, both because of the role of the state as well as because of the ethnic groups who take up violence in order to either receive recognition or because they have to be managed. Most ethnic groups oppose the status quo because they feel that it upsets the inter-ethnic balance of power and resources. For example, the Bodo Council of 1993 was responsible for the setting up of the Bodoland Autonomous Council, and according to this accord, the jurisdiction of the council extends over villages which has a majority of Bodo population. However, the Bodo leadership was unable to prove demographic majority in most of the villages. When they were unable to stop the influx of the people of Bodo or non-Bodo origin, they took a recourse to violence and they cleansed the villages of non-Bodo inhabitants, planning attacks, marking their houses, signing quit notices and forcing them to move on. Now, what are the challenges of the ethnic movements in a multi-ethnic society? Building a nation state in a multi-ethnic society is a difficult task, no doubt, filled with a lot of challenges and negotiations. India has witnessed many such ethnic movements which arose during the colonial period, but which became full-blown after the period of independence. I will focus on two of them, namely the Shiv Sena movement and the movement in Jharkhand. Now, the Shiv Sena movement arose as a nativist movement in 1966, advocating the conservation or preservation of the dominant Maratha ethos and safeguarding their economic aspirations. It claimed that Mumbai was for Maharashtrians, and it also claimed that the demographic profile of Mumbai was changing as Mumbai was a melting pot and it attracted a number of immigrants, and these change of demographic profile had left the non-Maharashtrians with not much scope for dominance either politically or culturally. So, therefore, the Shiv Sena demanded that 80% of the jobs and other economic opportunities should be reserved for the Maharashtrians. Migrants seeking jobs were to be discouraged in order to come to Maharashtra. Similarly, industrial production was to be raised so that it contributed to more and more employment of the Marathis. The Shiv Sainiks also targeted the South Indians in Mumbai, claiming that they were taking away the jobs. They were also against the communists because they felt that the communists were responsible for strikes and that affected production. Bal Thackeray and under his leadership, the Shiv Sena was able to bring in a number of concessions for the workers from the government, and they did not stop from engaging in violence. Eventually, the Shiv Sena found a lot of support amongst the lower and middle class people in Mumbai. Now, as far as the party's investment in the development of Maharashtrian identity is concerned, it gradually started being shaped by the larger ideology of the Hindutva, which turned the Muslims away from the Shiv Sena. Muslims were termed as anti-nationals and so were the communists, but it's only in the recent years that the party is in power and it has shown a degree of maturity participating in competitive politics and notwithstanding its internal divisions. Now, let me look at the Assam movement. In Assam, a similar nativist movement arose in the 1970s. Assam and Bengal in the eastern part of India, they have seen an influx of refugees after partition in 1947. People have come from 1947 onwards at different points of time, even after the borders were redrawn. Now, this particular movement emphasized the sons of the soil policy with respect to jobs and economic opportunities, and it feared that the Assamese would be reduced to a minority because the borders were porous. Now, though nativistic in nature, the Assam movement was led by the All Assam Students Union, and this particular group was seen to be a group which expressed the genuine aspiration of the Assamese people. The Assam movement was opposed to the influx of refugees from East Pakistan. They were fearful of losing control. They even feared a possible de-Assamization of the state bureaucracy. What the movement did was, it claimed that illegal migrants should be deported. They also thought that East Bengali migrants were, although they were both Hindus and Muslims, they were called Bangladeshis, and they lumped all immigrants from East Bengalis as Bangladeshis. And though in initial years the movement gained a kind of support from Assamese bureaucracy and the mainstream Assamese society, gradually rifts came into being, and this was supposed to be the handiwork of the Hiteshwar Saikia government, which tried to broaden the scope of Assam movement by including different groups, different populations in order to build a political platform. Now, the state government was forced to recognize that the movement actors had certain power over the people in Assam, and the Assam movement finally shaped itself through a spirit of ethnic accommodation. Despite ethnic polarization, the Assam Gana Parishad made an attempt to secure the support of the Bengali Muslim migrants, and there was some attempts at accommodation. One of the important effects of the Assam movement was that the immigrant issue became part of the public agenda in Assam, and the Assam Accord was signed in 1985. It brought in a spirit of compromise, a spirit of maturity as far as the Assam movement is concerned. Now, let me come to the conclusion of this particular module. As we have seen, ethnicity emerges as an important axis of social division in Indian society, in multi-ethnic societies like India, making the process of nation building a very daunting and a fraught task in contemporary times. Although we recognize caste, class and gender, the political significance of the term ethnicity, of the category ethnicity, is felt in different regions as ethnic groups become active and governments are forced to yield space and recognize them as they form a tangible social group. Different aspects of this ethnic group formation come to the forefront at different times. Diverse movements adopt ethnic markers and issues in order to assess or in order to foreground their distinctiveness. For example, the question of language becomes important in the case of Dravida Munnetra Kazhagam in Tamil Nadu. The question of Jharkhand movement, which led to the formation of the Jharkhand state, gave importance to history, shared experience of marginalization of the tribal people in Jharkhand. Alternatively, in Punjab, you will see that issues of the state ethnicizing secular issues of water distribution and territorial demarcation led to the agitation in Punjab. So, the propensity of the movements and the state to use violence has been noted, has been elaborated, but violence does not really yield much, and therefore, the ethnic movements have realized that they have to resort to a politics of accommodation in order to resolve the ethnic strife. Therefore, it is prudent for us to conclude by saying that ethnicity as a category is neither static nor is it predetermined, but it is shaped by the experiences of deprivation and denial of rights, and it is sustained by political rivalries and state action.